Lucas had been burned on THX 1138, and so was working to ensure that Star Wars would not meet the same fate as that film when it came to its release. While a 4th of July release was what conventional wisdom said would be good for Star Wars, Lucas had pushed for Memorial Day weekend instead. His reasoning was that Star Wars was going to need word-of-mouth help, so by doing it that weekend, there would be the chance for kids to see it and then go to school and tell all their friends about it. This was just one of many ways that Lucas was trying to get out in front of things to ensure that people would know about Star Wars, that he would at least have tapped into his target audience, science fiction fans and children. To help reach that audience would be Charles Lippincott, who was in charge of marketing for the film. Remember that in exchange for $500,000, Lucas got the bulk of the merchandising money for Star Wars, so Lippincott was working on both of those fronts. And with Lucas and Kurtz up to their armpits trying to get the film made, Lippincott was given free rein to handle this as he liked. And Lippincott was not some cold spreadsheet-using, soulless, buzzword-using drone that was treating this as just another project. He was a science fiction and comic book fan, and he knew that one way to reach the target audience for Star Wars was to give them a comic book. Marvel seemed the best bet. They were expanding their line, and it included characters like Conan the Barbarian, the kinds of books that Star Wars would fit right in with. And it was when he read Cody Starbuck that he knew the perfect person to handle this was Howard Chaykin. All he needed to do was convince Marvel. Fortunately, Lucas co-owned a comic book store with Ed Summer, and Summer set up a meeting with Roy Thomas, who was so excited over the project he wanted to write it personally, and he set up a meeting with Stan Lee to talk about it. At that meeting, Lippincott said that they would cover all the advertisement for the book. They would ensure that it would have a space at the 1976 San Diego Comic-Con, and best of all, the license cost for the first 5 issues is nothing. Lippincott might not have known this, but at the time, Marvel was in serious financial trouble. This was an offer too good for them to refuse. Even if the film was junk, they would still make a profit off the comics. And for Lippincott, he just ensured that every fan of comics in America would at least have heard about Star Wars and gotten a sense of what kind of film it was going to be. So at Comic-Con, they talked about both the comic and the upcoming film. Standard practice in the industry today, but like so much else with Star Wars, this was an entirely new paradigm. Lucas showed up for the convention personally and afterwards met with Chaykin to discuss what they could do to help him do the best he could with his art. It's clear from conversations that Lucas was a real admirer of his work as well, and he assured him that he was free to use the likeness of the performers in the comics. Those likenesses would, of course, be put on practically everything over the next 40 years as far as merchandising went. Unfortunately, Chaykin flaked out and much of the arc was farmed out to someone else, but it was nevertheless serving the purpose of spreading the word about Star Wars, which was further helped by the World Convention that had Lippincott alongside Kurtz and Mark Hamill himself. Among the many other avenues that Lippincott pursued was to create toys based around the movie. Mego, Hasbro, Mattel, none of them were interested. After all, movies come and movies go. Where is the future for this? Finally, he approached a small Cincinnati company called Kenner, which had just found success with its $6 Million Man action figure. And in April 1977, 1 month before the film was to be released, a contract was signed. The initial plan was for things like puzzles, board games, poster sets, things that could be done quickly, not really believing that interest would last much beyond the end of the year at best. But nevertheless, plans were underway to develop some action figures. Just not with any chance of coming out that year. It just was going to take too long to manufacture them. This would famously leave Kenner with what is perhaps the most ridiculous Christmas gift offered with complete sincerity: an empty box. The Star Wars action figures that Kenner would become famous for making would not arrive until the following year, and kids would get an empty box with a certificate inside saying that when the action figure does come out, this certificate would entitle them to Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, R2-D2, and Chewbacca. But while Lippincott was busy doing his thing, April was drawing to an end, and Lucas still had his work cut out for him. A nearly complete version was ready on May 1st for a preview screening in San Francisco, and even though there were still a few things to get done, the crowd went wild. Especially notable was George Lucas Sr., who was on hand. The elder George was a highly disciplined workaholic, self-made businessman, and a huge rift had formed between him and his son George Jr. when he said that he was going to go off to film school rather than joining the family business in a stationery store. During that shouting match, George Jr. blurted out that he would be a millionaire before the age of 30. Typical bluster of the young, of course, and yet, not only did George succeed at exactly that goal, but he would wind up having a personal net worth of $5.1 billion. For comparison, the most successful stationery store owner ever is worth about $200 million. George Sr. completely changed his tune when he discovered what a tremendous success his son was. He really was doing the right thing by going off to film school, and he showed up not only to show his support for his son, but to personally thank everyone who helped his son to make this movie, and agreed with everyone that this was a tremendous hit. Even Alan Ladd Jr. seemed relieved. It was only George Lucas himself who was still concerned about it. His fears did prove justified. At the next screening, it was the complete opposite. One comment left was, "This is the worst movie I've seen since Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster." The board of directors weren't convinced either. A few thought it was incredible, some thought it was good, many thought it was going to be a huge dud. Work went ahead and the film was finished with barely enough time to get it to the cinemas, and even then Lucas was still hard at work getting the audio track finalized for certain releases that couldn't use the full stereo. Lucas was thus caught completely unawares when the film proved to be such a massive hit. And even then he was unsure, seemingly very pessimistic even in the face of his certain success here. But Alan Ladd kept calling him up to tell him what the returns were and assure him that this success was real and beyond their wildest dreams. When Star Wars would break the record set by Jaws, Spielberg took out a full-page ad in Variety to congratulate his friend on the success. George Lucas had done it. It wasn't 100% what he had wanted, and many things felt incomplete to him. But at least he knew no one had taken this movie away from him, not this time, and it delivered something that had been missing in this dark era. Many diminished the success of Star Wars to a degree by saying that Star Wars benefited from perfect timing. Had it come out at any other time, it wouldn't have been the success that it was. But I think what's vital to remember with this is that Lucas deliberately chose this time. He chose it because he could see something was missing right now. All of American cinema was going in one direction, and he deliberately turned and walked in the opposite direction. And the result was a film that people had been waiting for and didn't even know it. Time magazine summed it up best. They said, "Star Wars is aimed at kids. The kid in everybody." American Graffiti, shot for under $1 million, had been the most profitable film of all time. Star Wars would prove to be the most successful. And whatever he would go on to do, it seemed that things could only get better for George Lucas.